What's happening, everybody? Ron, Tyke Oliver, Tyke, call me Tyke. That's my nickname. Everybody that knows me calls me Tyke. Uh, my sidekick here, TC, better known as Triple Clef. Uh, he's been with me for a while now, and you'll see him on every broadcast for the most part. I just wanted to chime in real quick this session. Just wanted to talk about the decades of music, the best decades of music, the Mount Rushmore of the best decades of music. And I feel personally that it's pretty much indisputable. I think it's generational, depending on your age. I get that. But as far as I'm concerned, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s are by far, to me, the best decades of music ever. You put the 60s in there with, Motown and the Beatles and, I know there was some great music in the 50s and the 40s. I get all that. But the impact that the 60s had with, just just those two acts alone, to me, Motown with all of the, which was just a generational sound, was unbelievable. And then the Beatles, of course, came on the scene with the Rolling Stones and how rock changed and how British rock changed, rock music in the United States and how that took off. And also, it was just an amazing time. The Jackson Five and that's the first time we had ever kind of really seen an act like that. But the 70s, was when we got into Blue Eye Soul and of course there was at the end of the 60s and the early 70s, you had the protest songs, Bob Dylan and that whole thing, was real impactful because we were just in civil rights movement was right in there. You had the war ending right in there. You had 70s black people, the black power movement, and the women's movement kind of started in that. And so the psychedelic funk and the Woodstock and all of that was kind of mixed in, which made the 70s very, the late 60s, early 70s really got, eclectic amount of music, and it was really weird right in there because it was, let's face it, there were a lot of drugs that was mixed in with that. But also in the 70s, you had these great songwriters, man. The songwriting was just, to me, at an all-time high. One of my favorites decades about the 70s, to me, was one of the best decades because it was just really about the songwriter, man. There was no videos and all this other stuff, so it was really predicated on what was going to go on the radio, and the song had to capture what it was all about within 3-4 minutes. And just some great songwriters, classic rock towards the end of the 70s, middle towards the end of the 70s. I mean, we could go all day on just the 70s alone. And then the 80s introduced a whole nother situation with, of course, video, which some dispute destroyed music, but it brought another element to music. The synthesizer brought a whole nother element to music. A lot of pop records now, that kind of brought in that situation, and some of it was, pretty cheesy stuff, but then there was a lot of good music in the 80s, man. Of course, Michael Jackson just kind of smashed. I was in high school around that time, man, and just pretty much smashed the whole thing. You know, black, white, rock, pop, what all that meant. And MTV was just getting its legs. Hip hop had really just kind of taken over a certain segment as well. The funk bands kind of dwindled off. You know, in the 70's, there were the funk bands, and that kind of, which I was a huge fan of. My group was Parliament Funkadelic, Cameo, you know, the Gap Band. I used to love that stuff. But the 80's, even in jazz, the 80's, you know, introduced, you know, more fusion and the electronic instrument versus real instruments, which a lot of people say destroyed music, or you know, the you know, the fundamental enthusiasts, the guys that you know, the true believers, the old schoolers at the time, you know, really absolutely hated the that electric sound and the synthesizers. And a lot of music, let's face it, a lot of musicians got put out of work because you didn't have to have as many musicians in the studio with you. So it was a very interesting situation with the 80's. And then the 90's came about, and I think things got a little weird in the 90's. There were, you know, hip hop really took over late 80's, early 90's. There's no doubt about it. That's when it really got its legs. But then you had the boy bands kind of come on the scene with you know, New Kids on the Block, New Edition, and Boys to Men, and you know, all of that. So that was a very interesting time because kind of music was still trying to kind of find itself after the 80's. Michael Jackson and Prince and Madonna and Whitney Houston were some of the biggest acts in the 80's, the big hair bands in the 80's. In the 90's, things got a little weird. I think Nirvana came on the scene and kind of was a backlash to that. And, you know, it was a weird time, you know, but very interesting music. It was a good mix of protest against the pop stuff, but pop was still, you know, R&B was trying to make a comeback, and really weird, interesting stuff. And I think one of these times I'm going to break each one of these decades down. But just to wrap it up, you know, the 60's, the 70's, the 80's, and the 90's, I believe, are definitely the Mount Rushmore. Now, interesting debate would be which decade is the best decade. That's where it's going to be extremely interesting once we get into that. But I wanted to just give you my Mount Rushmore. So I'm going to wrap it up. I just wanted to kind of chime in on that real quick, and I'm going to expand on this as well. But like I said, the 60's, the 70's, the 80's, the 90's is my Mount Rushmore there. Mount Rushmore or Rushmore music, where music producers, musicians, historians, and the passionate music lover debate and discuss the best of all time. That's what we do at Rushmore Music. We're on Instagram at Call Me Tyke, Tyke, Call Me Tyke. You can get us on Facebook as well. Just, you know, go to Facebook's browser and put in Rushmore Music. You'll find us right away. And also, we're on Twitter. And, you know, hit us on social media. Check us out. We really want to expand this because we're working on a new app. Eventually, we will get that up and running because we think this is a great idea. And all you musicians out there, you know, we want you to chime in. Music producers, chime in. If you disagree with me, that's cool. Please chime in. I want to see what other people are thinking. That's one of the main reasons for Rushmore Music. We want that back and forth. We're starting on social media, so please, you know, chime in on social media and let us know what you think. All right, so again, Rushmore Music, Call Me Tyke, TC, Treble Clef, my partner. We're out.